I come before you today in this courtroom to make the case that it's time to change the story of business. It's time for a new narrative. And the stakes in this are high. 3 billion people of the 7 billion on our planet work in the world of business. But my story today is also one about personal inspiration and how it can come to you in the most unwelcome times and in the most trying times. And I'm going to start my TED Talk today with a story about someone who inspired me to see this new story in business so very clearly. So, there we go. I'm going to speak today about my younger brother, Bob. He's the little guy in that funky stroller that I'm sure IDEO did not design. We are from a family of 6 children. I was number 3, and Bob was number 4. And he was the classic shadow little brother, the classic tag-along. Everywhere I went, he went with me. We shared a bedroom for all of our childhood on the 3rd floor of our home. And we would play crazy mathematical sports games well into the night and talk until my father climbed those stairs every night about midnight and shut us down. Well, this little guy grew up to be the most amazing physician. He went to the Johns Hopkins University and was a star chemistry student. He then went on to the University of Pittsburgh Medical School and could have chosen any specialty, but he chose family medicine. And he returned to his hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to set up his life and set up his practice. Well, I love returning to my hometown and running into his patients. In fact, they seek you out. They burst with energy about this guy. They can't wait to tell you about his diagnostic abilities, about how he makes connections, how he sees things others don't, which results in people getting better and many stories of lives saved. But more powerfully, they talk about how he treats people and how he treats patients, how he's fully engaged when people come to see him, about his generosity, his kindness, his listening, his empathy. They tell stories about coming in for a procedure or an exam. And he never starts with that. He starts with talking about their family, their hobbies, the community, what they're passionate about. They tell me he never has a bad day. There's never a mean comment. He is the finest human being I have ever met. Well, on August 30th, 2001, I got a phone call late at night. And Bob called me to tell me he had leukemia. And his voice was shaky, but he was concerned about how I was taking the news that night. And of course, Bob being Bob, he diagnosed it himself. His back had ached for a few days. He had a low-grade fever he couldn't bring down, so he went in for blood work. Well, August was also the month I was appointed to one of the greatest jobs in all of business, the Global Marketing Officer for Procter & Gamble, the world's largest advertiser, by far, and the most influential consumer goods company in the world. Well, you know what it's like when you get calls like that. Many of you in this room have had that experience when a loved one calls with news like that. It turns everything upside down, as you know. Well, suddenly, this job I was so eager to jump into, I had worked my career for this kind of job, suddenly seemed very meaningless, very trivial. Here I'd go to work to grow Procter & Gamble's mighty brands while my brother was fighting day in and day out to beat a very, very tough disease. Well, that night I chatted with my wife. We talked about what we should do, what we could do. Of course, we would open up our lives more to be with them in this time, with Bob and his wife and his family and our whole family. But I thought more deeply. I thought about maybe I should take a leave of absence to be with him more, to be with them, to open up my life more for them. And I mentioned that to Bob. And you can guess his reaction. Oh, come on, Jim, I'll be fine. Don't do that. Keep doing what you love. We're all so very proud of you. Well, we were so close growing up, but we were really different. I was the extrovert. Bob was the introvert. He was science, I was humanities. He was straight A's, I was class clown. And he returned to his hometown to set up his life, and I traveled the world for P&G. But you know, over the years, in so many ways, in emails and handwritten notes and phone calls, he would tell me how very proud he was of me and what I was doing with my life. And now, I had this intense feeling I wanted to make him even prouder. So we went to visit him after that call, and we spent a long weekend with Bob. He was already in the hospital. Chemotherapy had already started. And we chatted, we talked, we watched TV. And I returned to Cincinnati after that long weekend with my wife. I went back to work. And I thought. And you know, suddenly, something came to me. And I thought to myself, why don't I take this big, wonderful job I just was appointed to and reimagine it with my brother in mind? What if I dedicated this job to him in a way? What if I thought about him every day when I went to work? What if he was in the room with me in every meeting, every phone call, every engagement? What if I could approach this job with the values and principles he held so dearly? What if I could make him even prouder? So let's think for a moment what was going on in August 2001 in the world around us. Well, the dot-com bubble had just burst. 9/11 happened about 10 days later. Google, this 3-year-old company, not yet public, was starting to change how we all live our lives and do our work. Apple had just introduced the iPod and had just opened their first retail store. And the millennials, this cohort, and I'm a parent of 2 of them, was reaching their teenage years. And my company, Procter & Gamble, was deeply thinking how and why we do business with a new management team in place. So it was an incredible confluence of events. And I didn't know it at the time, but the age-old story of business was unraveling. And you all know that story as well as I do. Hierarchies, command and control, sacrifice anything to hit the quarterly number, win, lose, closed systems. This was all coming apart. And look at the companies that fell in that decade, some out of business. Companies like AIG, Bear Stearns, Sears. And meanwhile, there was a new breed of companies arising. The Innocents out of the UK, the Emirates out of the Middle East, the Zappos, and of course the Googles and Apples. So I began to think, with all of this in mind, all of this going on in my head in this new job, I began to think, what if businesses could be much more about building deep, authentic relationships, and to do that sincerely and authentically? What if business's new metaphor was relationships? What if we thought about generosity and giving and service and passion and making a difference? What if leaders set their sights higher? What if it was more about purpose and mission and ideals? What if in this age of emerging social networks, they were just starting, we could listen better? So what if business could be, simply put, more about how my brother approached his life? Well, this casual exploration, which I began to work on and implement and think about and try at P&G, led to a personal quest for me. And it did lead me to leave the company that I so loved after 25 years. I wanted to pursue this with 100% of my time and freedom and passion and energy. So I dove into it after I left in 2008. I started teaching. I started writing. I visited hundreds of people to talk to them about what they believed. And many actually are in this room. People like Scott Cook, people like Laurie Coots and Lee Clow and David Outshall. And I learned and learned and learned as much as I could. And what was clear to me, so clear, that a new story was emerging. And this story was happening at a time when one voice could bring down a regime, when one voice could change a corporate decision, when people around the world, so-called consumers, were really changing how they buy and what they buy and how they cared. Look at some data to show this shift from the old story to the new. 19% of Americans trust big business. That is dreadful. And by the way, that number is similar in other countries around the world. 30% of people feel engaged, passionate, energized, and bring their whole selves to work. Again, a dreadful number. And now shifting to the news story, and some positivism and optimism here, 64% of high-performing companies say corporate character is a major driver of their success. Well, I would suggest we are entering a new era, and I call it the era of higher ideals. This is the new story. This is the new narrative, and in my mind, it is the only way forward. Now, when I say ideals, I mean why you exist, the higher order benefit you bring to the world, how you attract talent. And this comes from the beliefs and the values of the organization. It's so often rooted in the heritage. Here are 3 lovely examples of ideals-based companies. Lindt, the lovely chocolate company out of Zurich, their ideal is simply to bring joy to people through small luxuries. And Method, the great home care company out of San Francisco, their ideal is to be a catalyst for a healthy, happy revolution in home care. And Petrobras, the large Brazilian energy company, they exist for the sustainable development of Brazil and all companies they operate in. Now, this ideal is important, it's critical, it's the first step, but it's only the beginning. The ideal must drive everything. It must drive the behavior. Right? It has to drive the rituals, the systems, the processes of a company, the culture. And it must influence the communication that happens inside the company and outside, and all of that has to be coherent. And of course, it has to impact the experience people have with our brands, and must then cascade down through the measurement and evaluation systems. So we're at TED. We're dreaming. We're exuberant with the ideas we're talking about. But maybe here, even at TED, in this environment, this sounds a bit dreamy, a bit lofty, a bit idealistic, if you will, for the tough world of business. Well, I'm very confident this is the new story, and I'll tell you why. I commissioned some research a few years ago. The company called Miller Brown, large global research company. They have the best database of brands in the world, 50,000 brands. And I asked them, and it goes back about 20 years, I asked them to cut the data for the last 10 years. And I wanted to look at the top 50 brands who had moved the most in affinity with their customers and also moved the most in financial wealth creation. And here's what I found. They were ideals-based by and large, these 50 brands, mission-based. And over that 10-year period, they outperformed financially in shareholder return. They outperformed the S&P 500 by 400%. And they grew 3 to 10 times faster than their competition. So let's look at, very quickly, 2 companies from that top 50. And the first is Discovery Communications. You all know them. 28 years old, founded by John Hendricks, the largest nonfiction media company in the world, $4.5 billion in sales. And their ideal has always been to satisfy the curiosity about the universe or the multiverse all around us. I spent several days with that company in my research, and I asked the head of HR, what does curiosity mean to you? And she said to me, well, it's simple. Every year on employee work plans, we ask them to pick one attribute related to curiosity and make progress against it that year. Second company, I love this one. We heard the mayor of Rio de Janeiro talk about this company yesterday. IBM, it shows you can do it in large, complex public companies. And their ideal, you all know it, is to create a smarter planet. Now, John Iwata, one of their senior leaders, when I asked him what this means to him, he said, when we embrace this, our language changed, and our measurements changed. So if this is so compelling, if this works, why aren't we moving faster? What's going on? Well, I think we have a big barrier. And I think that barrier is very simple. We don't bring our whole selves to work. We don't bring our whole selves, and we don't bring our whole brain. Now, Daniel Pink accelerated the discussion about the power and the potential of bringing our whole brain to work. We know it. We simply must get on with it. We need to role model it ourselves. We need to expect it from our people. We need to reward it, and we need to talk about it a lot. I want to share two provocative short stories about my days at P&G about the power and potential of bringing your whole brain to work. When I went into this great new job and I approached it in the way I've just talked about, I traveled a lot, of course, and I met with employees in training sessions, at dinners, at lunches, and I used to ask them, why do you go home at night and on weekends and do incredible things in your community and with the organizations you're passionate about? Why aren't you bringing that to work? Why aren't you doing that work through our brands? Why don't you bring that passion, that mentality? Well, they didn't feel like we expected it. And when we liberated that, amazing stuff started to happen. And it happened on brands like Pampers and like Always and Tide and Ariel and Downey Lenore and even Charmin and Old Spice. And by the way, the results changed. Second story. We fielded some groundbreaking research among the people who bought our brands, consumers, and they could tell from the signals we were sending that if the people behind each of the brands were passionate, loving their work, engaged in it. So can you imagine the implications of that? Okay, so let's take a deep breath. Deep yoga breath through the stomach. Relax for a moment, and let's dream. Let's just dream for a moment. And if you're comfortable, close your eyes. And I'd like you to dream a little bit about the ideas we've just been talking about for the last 15 minutes. What if this became a movement? What if the exceptions we're talking about, the innocents and the methods and the Zappos and the IBMs, what if they became the norm? What would that look like? And what would that feel like? So, look around this room here. 3 billion people are involved in the world of business. What if all of us, and some large percentage of that 3 billion, adopted this new narrative, this new story? How would organizations change? How would innovation change? How would advertising change? How would business change? On November 4th, 2010, my brother Bob died of leukemia. And his spirit wasn't ready to go. His son had just graduated from college, and by the way, talk about pride, was on his way to medical school. He had a daughter still in college and a son in high school. Well, his body was worn out after 9 years of fighting that very tough disease, but his spirit was still vital. Bob loved the nickname I had growing up. It was bestowed on me, given to me by an old Irish uncle, a very funny one, and Bob chuckled at it often, and it was Champ. The nickname was Champ. Well, the last time I saw my brother was the day before he died, and I was leaving his bedside in the hospital, and I went over. He was very heavily sedated, and I went over to him, and I kissed him on the head, and I whispered in his ear. I said to him, "Bob, I love you." And I said, "Bob, you are the real champ. And you know what he did? His body came out of that bed. The nurses were blown away because he hadn't moved much. And he came toward me, and he lifted his shoulders up. And I thought, my God, he's always about others, even until the end. So, my brother Bob, in ways I had no idea at the time, and I don't think he ever fully realized, was and is my inspiration. He helped me to see a very different world of business and actually to approach my business life in a very, very different way and with a different spirit. So I'd like to invite you this morning to join in this new story, to join in this new narrative. And I'd like to end with a few suggestions on how to get started, or if you're doing it, how to accelerate your momentum. And the first one is, you must articulate your ideal. It must be explicit. You must talk about it. It's amazing to me, in my travels, in my research, in my consulting, leaders don't do this. And it has to be, by the way, inspirational and really engaging to your employees, your people. So it has to be articulate, it has to be explicit, and it must attract talent. It must bring people to you. If it doesn't work internally, it will never work externally. It has to be authentic. And the third suggestion, and this is the most important one, when times are tough, everyone will be watching your behavior. You have to live this ideal when times are good and when times are tough. That's the magic behind it. So, I've committed my life to this new ideal, this new way, this new story. And I'd love to invite you to act on it and to act now. It's urgent, it's big, it's important. And I'd like to welcome you to join this new story, but let's not join it as players or actors. I'd like to invite you to join it as leaders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
So, do we have a question? One question.
We do. How do you stick to your ideals at times like these, which seem contradictory to what the capital market is currently measuring, like shareholder value?
And a brief answer on this.
It's not contradictory. If you want to get to shareholder value, you activate and operate against your ideals. That's the way, that's what my research shows.
Okay, so I want us to vote now, with our heads, not our hearts, on this question. Is the case made that a business strategy of higher ideals will actually help you win in business in the future? I believe that's a fair way to phrase the
Well done, Chris.
proposition. Those who think case not carried, raise their hands.
Not carried.
Not carried.
We'll talk afterward.
Those who think the case carried, raise their hands. Jim, you are out of jail. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank
you.
you
Thanks,
very
everyone.
much.